The smile that hid the storm. Las Vegas in the late summer of 1967 was a city built on illusion, neon lights masking exhaustion, velvet curtains hiding debts, laughter echoing loudest where fear lived closest. The Sands Hotel stood at the center of it all, a palace of polished marble and cigarette smoke, where deals were whispered in hallways and legends were made or broken before dessert arrived. That night, every seat in the Copa room was filled. 300 people, journalists, celebrities, casino executives, high rollers with diamond cufflinks and restless eyes, had gathered for something rare. A Rat Pack reunion, 2 icons, 1 stage. At the heart of it stood Dean Martin, calm as ever, moving through the backstage corridor with the ease of a man who had learned long ago that panic never improved performance. He arrived early as he always did, not because he needed the time, but because discipline had quietly replaced chaos in his life years before. The tuxedo was pressed, the shoes polished, the set list memorized, not because anyone demanded it, but because Dean demanded it of himself. People loved the image of him better when they thought he didn't care. The half-smile, the loose tie, the drink always within reach. It made audiences feel closer to him, like they were sharing a secret joke with a man too charming to take life seriously. But behind the image was a professional who understood something most never did. If you wanted to survive in this business, you had to show up ready, even when your heart was. Especially then. Dean sat in his dressing room, fork paused halfway to his mouth, when the door flew open without a knock. The energy in the room shifted instantly, like air before a storm. Frank Sinatra filled the doorway, sharp suit, sharp eyes, anger barely contained. Frank didn't enter rooms, he conquered them. People felt him before they heard him, and when he was in one of his darker moods, even the walls seemed to tense. "We need to talk," Frank said, voice low but burning. Dean looked up slowly, setting his fork down with deliberate calm. "About what?" "About you," Frank snapped. "About what you've been doing behind my back." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and immediate. Dean straightened slightly, confusion crossing his face, not defensiveness, not fear, just disbelief. "Frank, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Frank said, stepping closer. "I know you've been talking to management. I know you've been meeting with people here, planning to stay when I leave." Dean blinked once. "That's not true." "Don't lie to me." "I'm not," Dean said evenly. "I haven't met with anyone. I haven't negotiated anything. You're getting bad information." Frank laughed, sharp and humorless. Funny how everyone suddenly has bad information when it's about loyalty. That word, loyalty, cut deeper than Frank probably intended. For 20 years, Dean had stood beside him through scandals, temper tantrums, marriages that didn't last, reputations that cracked and were rebuilt. Loyalty wasn't something Dean talked about. It was something he lived. "Frank," Dean said quietly, standing now, meeting his friend eye to eye, "you really think I'd betray you like that, after everything?" For a moment, something flickered across Frank's face, doubt, maybe even shame, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Anger had already chosen its story. "I don't know what to think anymore," Frank muttered. "Everyone's got an angle." "Not me," Dean replied. "I'm looking out for us." The silence stretched. Finally, Frank exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "If I leave here, you come with me, we do it together." Dean didn't hesitate. "Then I'm coming with you." Frank nodded, satisfied, though the tension never truly left his shoulders. He turned and walked out as abruptly as he'd entered, leaving Dean alone with a cold plate of food and a feeling he couldn't shake, that something fragile had just been stepped on. The show began exactly at 8. The curtain rose to thunderous applause, 2 legends side by side stepping into the light as if nothing in the world could ever touch them. The audience laughed at the familiar banter, clapped along to the songs, drank in the nostalgia like a fine whiskey. To them, this was magic, effortless, timeless. Dean played his role perfectly. The charming drunk, the easy laugh, the man who looked like he'd wandered onto the stage by accident and somehow stolen it anyway. He had perfected that act over decades, crafted it carefully, sharpened it like a blade wrapped in velvet. It made people underestimate him, and that, he'd learned, was power. But tonight, Frank's energy was wrong. There were pauses where none should be, jokes that lingered too long in the air, glances thrown Dean's way that carried something colder than humor. Dean felt it, the way a seasoned sailor feels a change in wind long before the storm arrives. Then Frank stepped forward and took the microphone alone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, smiling, "I want to talk about my good friend here." The audience laughed, relaxed. This was familiar territory, safe. "I've learned a lot from Dean over the years," Frank continued. "Mostly how to drink and still function." More laughter. Dean smiled, bowing slightly, playing along. But Frank didn't stop. "He drinks more than any man I've ever met," Frank went on. "Medical science should study him." The laughter grew thinner, less certain. "And let's be honest," Frank said, his tone sharpening just enough to change the room. "Half the time he's not acting." Silence rippled outward like a dropped glass. Dean's smile didn't fade, but something behind it hardened. "Frank," he said gently into his microphone, "maybe we move on to the next song." Frank ignored him. "Tell them," Frank pressed, "tell them how much you drink before a show." The room went completely still, 300 people holding their breath. Dean felt the line snap, not with anger but with clarity. This wasn't banter. This was something else, something public, something meant to wound. He stepped forward and took the microphone from Frank's hand. Not aggressively, not theatrically, but firmly, the way a man does when he has decided that silence would be the greater mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said, his voice calm, steady, unmistakably controlled. "You paid to see a show tonight. What you're witnessing instead is a personal issue being dragged into the spotlight." Every eye locked onto him. "What Frank just said," Dean continued, "is not true. The drunk is an act, a character. One I created because it made people laugh, because it made them feel comfortable, because it gave me room to work." He turned slightly toward Frank, not accusing, not pleading, honest. "I've never been drunk on this stage, never drunk on a film set, never let alcohol interfere with my work, and Frank knows that." Frank stood frozen. "I've spent my entire career earning trust," Dean said, now addressing the room again. "Trust from audiences, from directors, from studios, from the people who work with me. Tonight, that trust was challenged, not by truth, but by anger." The silence was absolute. "So let me be clear," Dean finished. "I am not a drunk, I am a professional, and I deserve to be treated like one." He handed the microphone back to the bandleader and stepped away. The applause that followed hesitant, stunned, but deeply respectful. Backstage, the laughter and ease were gone. Something had broken in front of witnesses who would never forget it. And for the first time that night, Frank Sinatra understood that words, once spoken, could not be called back. When silence became louder than applause, the 15-minute intermission felt longer than any show Dean Martin had ever performed. Behind the curtain, the Copa room buzzed with whispers instead of music, the kind of low, electric murmuring that only comes after something has gone terribly, publicly wrong. Glasses clinked without enthusiasm. Cigarettes burned down forgotten between fingers. Journalists leaned toward one another, already shaping headlines in their minds, already deciding which version of the truth would sell best by morning. Dean sat alone in his dressing room, jacket still on, bow tie loosened but not removed. He hadn't collapsed. He hadn't raged. He hadn't thrown anything. That restraint, so quiet it almost went unnoticed, was the most dangerous thing in the room. Men who lost control were expected. Men who stayed calm after humiliation made people uneasy because calm meant calculation, and calculation meant consequences. A soft knock broke the silence. "Dean," came a familiar voice. "It's me." He opened the door to Sammy Davis, Jr., whose eyes carried a mix of concern and disbelief. Sammy stepped inside and closed the door behind him, shaking his head slowly as if still trying to understand what he had just witnessed. "I've seen fights backstage," Sammy said quietly. "I've seen egos explode, but that out there," he paused, "that was different." Dean sank onto the couch, exhaling for the first time since leaving the stage. "Yeah," he said softly, "it was." Sammy sat beside him. "You okay?" Dean let out a humorless half-smile. "I will be." That answer alone told Sammy everything. Dean Martin wasn't the kind of man who fell apart in front of others. If something hurt him, he carried it inward, examined it, and decided what it meant before letting anyone else see a crack. The persona the public adored, the carefree crooner who laughed everything off, was nowhere in that room. What remained was a man who understood that reputations, once damaged, rarely healed cleanly. "You didn't humiliate him back," Sammy said after a moment. "Most guys would have gone for the throat." Dean nodded slowly. "That would have been easy and useless." Sammy studied him. Frank crossed a line. "I know," Dean replied, "and lines crossed on a stage don't stay on a stage." When the curtain rose again, the audience applauded, but the sound was thinner, restrained, as if everyone feared clapping too loudly might make the tension real again. Dean walked back out first this time, posture straight, expression composed. Frank followed a step behind, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, a man suddenly aware that power didn't protect him from consequence. They finished the show because professionals always did. The songs were flawless, the timing was perfect, the laughter came on cue, but the magic, the invisible thread that once bound them, was gone. What remained was performance without warmth, craft without joy. Even the audience could feel it. People left the Copa room not buzzing, not glowing, but thoughtful, already retelling the story in hushed tones as they made their way through the casino. By midnight, the story had legs. By morning, it had wings. Hollywood didn't wait for facts. By sunrise, phones rang across the city. Agents called producers, producers called publicists, publicists called anyone who might control the damage before it became permanent. Headlines spread faster than explanations ever could. Some versions were sympathetic, others were brutal. Sinatra explodes on stage. Dean Martin publicly accused. Rat Pack cracks in front of witnesses. Dean read none of them. He didn't need to. The questions told him everything. Is it true you drink before performances? How much of the drunk act is real? Did Sinatra finally say what everyone's been thinking? Each question carried the same poison beneath it, not accusation, but doubt. And doubt, Dean knew, was the real enemy. You could survive scandal, you could even survive betrayal. But doubt seeped into everything. It followed you into casting rooms. It lingered in studio meetings. It whispered in places where reputations were decided by instinct rather than evidence. At home, the mood was quiet but tense. His wife watched him closely, her concern sharpened by anger she refused to disguise. He humiliated you, she said plainly, in front of everyone. Dean nodded. He was angry. That doesn't excuse it. No, Dean agreed. It explains it. She crossed her arms. Are you going to let this stand? Dean looked out the window, Las Vegas sunlight cutting harshly against the glamour of the night before. I'm not going to fight him in public, he said. That's what people expect. And what do you expect? She asked. I expect the truth to outlast the noise, he replied. But I'm not naive. Truth needs help sometimes. The call that changed everything came 2 days later. It was short, professional, almost gentle. Dean, the voice on the other end, said, "We want you, with or without Frank." The offer wasn't just money. It was something far rarer, independence. For 20 years, Dean Martin had been Frank Sinatra's Dean Martin, the charming counterbalance, the loyal second, the man who made the star shine brighter by standing just far enough to the side. Dean never complained. Dean never demanded top billing. He'd understood the unspoken rules and played within them. Now, for the first time, someone was offering him a stage where he wouldn't be defined by anyone else's shadow. Dean didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The silence on the line told him the truth. They already knew his value. When he hung up, he sat alone for a long time, thinking not about contracts or headlines, but about loyalty, about friendship, about whether standing beside someone for decades meant accepting being wounded by them, or whether real loyalty required drawing a line and defending it. Frank called that night. Dean let it ring. Then again the next morning. Dean let it ring again. When he finally picked up, his voice was calm but distant. "What do you want, Frank?" "I messed up," Frank said without preamble. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something rawer, more dangerous, regret. "I was fed bad information, I believed it, and I lashed out." "You didn't just lash out," Dean replied. "You questioned my integrity in front of people who decide careers." "I know," Frank said, "and I'll fix it." "You can't," Dean said quietly. "You can't unsay something once it's heard." There was silence on the line, heavy and helpless. "I was scared," Frank finally admitted. "Scared you were leaving me behind." Dean closed his eyes. That truth landed harder than the insult ever had. "You should have trusted me," he said. "I should have," Frank whispered. Dean exhaled slowly. "I need time." "How much?" "I don't know," Dean replied. "Enough to decide whether this friendship is worth rebuilding." He hung up before Frank could answer. That night, Dean sat alone, the city lights flickering like distant stars, thinking not about anger but about choice. Power didn't come from humiliating someone in return. It came from deciding who you were when the world pushed you to react. He had been underestimated his entire career, and he had survived because of it. Now, the question wasn't whether he could forgive. The question was whether forgiveness would cost him the one thing he had spent his life protecting: respect. And somewhere in Las Vegas, Frank Sinatra finally understood that the man he had tried to break wasn't weak, wasn't careless, and wasn't replaceable. The storm had passed, but the reckoning had only just begun. The night Dean Martin stopped being Frank's friend. The city noticed before the newspapers did. Las Vegas had a way of sensing shifts in power the same way the desert sensed storms, quietly, instinctively, long before thunder ever arrived. Casino managers changed their tone. Booking agents stopped assuming names would come in pairs. Invitations that once read Frank and Dean began arriving separately, carefully worded, as if the ink itself were afraid of choosing sides too early. For the first time in 2 decades, Dean Martin woke up to a world that wasn't sure where to place him, and that uncertainty terrified everyone except Dean himself. He didn't rush to correct it. That restraint confused people. Hollywood expected explosions, counterattacks, public statements, dramatic interviews dripping with righteous anger. Instead, Dean went quiet. No press tour. No denials shouted across headlines. No carefully staged photographs meant to reassure the public that everything was fine. Silence in his hands became strategy. Behind closed doors, though, the pressure was relentless. Studio executives circled like polite sharks, pretending concern while testing weakness. "You understand how perception works," they'd say gently, as if explaining something to a child. "This doesn't have to define you if handled correctly." Handled correctly to them meant distancing himself quietly, staying agreeable, not making waves, remaining the Dean Martin they could rely on, charming, harmless, easy to package. But Dean had learned something that night on stage. Being easy to underestimate had protected him for years, but it had also trapped him. And he was done being trapped. The call from Caesar's palace came again, this time with numbers attached, numbers that spoke of respect, not charity. The offer was explicit, unmistakable, and impossible to misread. Solo billing. Creative control. No shared contracts. No assumptions. Dean listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When the voice on the other end finished, waiting breathlessly, Dean didn't accept immediately. He asked one question instead. "Do you want Dean Martin," he said calmly, "or do you want half of something else?" There was no hesitation in the reply. "We want you." When he hung up, Dean sat still for a long time, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood exactly what accepting meant. This wasn't just a career decision. It was a declaration, a quiet but unmistakable step out of a shadow he had never publicly acknowledged. And shadows don't disappear without consequences. Frank Sinatra found out the same way everyone else did, through whispers that grew louder the more people pretended not to hear them. His phone rang constantly, but the voices on the other end were different now. Less deferential, less careful. "Frank, we're hearing Dean might go solo." "Frank, is the partnership still solid?" "Frank, should we plan future bookings separately?" Each question landed like a small betrayal, not because Dean was wrong to leave, but because Frank hadn't believed he ever would. When Frank finally drove to Dean's house, unannounced, uninvited, he wasn't wearing his armor. No entourage, no bravado, just a man who had lost control of a narrative he'd always assumed belonged to him. Dean didn't rush to the door, he didn't need to. Letting Frank wait, even briefly, wasn't cruelty, it was balance. "You shouldn't be here," Dean said when he finally opened the door. "I know," Frank replied. His voice was quieter than Dean had ever heard it, "but I didn't know where else to go." That admission alone carried more weight than any apology Frank had ever offered. Frank Sinatra was not a man who confessed uncertainty. He commanded rooms. He bent situations to his will. And yet here he stood, uncertain and exposed, realizing too late that power meant very little when trust was gone. Inside, the air was heavy with things unsaid. Dean gestured toward a chair but didn't sit himself, choosing instead to remain standing, subtle, deliberate, unmistakable. You believed someone else over me, Dean said evenly. That wasn't a mistake, that was a choice. Frank nodded slowly. I know. You didn't just question my loyalty, Dean continued. You questioned my integrity on a stage, in front of people who will remember that moment longer than they remember your apology. Frank swallowed hard. I was afraid. Dean met his eyes. Fear explains things, it doesn't excuse them. The words landed like a verdict. For the first time in years, Frank didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He didn't charm his way out. He just sat there, smaller than his reputation, realizing that the man he had tried to embarrass had quietly outgrown him. I can't undo what I did, Frank said finally, but I need to know if I've lost you. Dean considered him for a long moment, not angrily, not sentimentally, honestly. You lost the version of me who stood beside you without question, Dean said. That man doesn't exist anymore. Frank's shoulders sagged. But Dean continued, you haven't lost the chance to earn something better. Frank looked up, hope flickering dangerously in his eyes. If we're going to be friends, Dean said, it won't be because I orbit you. It'll be because we meet as equals, separate careers, separate stages, mutual respect. No public jokes that cut deeper than laughter. Frank nodded slower this time. I can do that. Dean shook his head slightly. You don't promise it, you prove it. The announcement came days later, brief and unemotional, but it sent shockwaves through the industry. Dean Martin signs solo contract. Dean Martin headlines Caesar's Palace, alone. No attacks, no explanations, just facts. Hollywood reacted instantly. Some praised his dignity, others quietly recalculated their assumptions. For the first time, Dean wasn't being discussed as part of a duo, a group, a dynamic. He was being discussed as a force. Frank read every article. Each one felt like another reminder that the man he once assumed would always be there had chosen himself, and survived. On opening night at Caesar's Palace, Dean walked onto the stage alone. No rat pack, no familiar crutches, just a man, a microphone, and a room holding its breath. The applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Dean smiled, not the lazy grin the public loved, but something steadier, deeper. Not triumph, resolution. He sang better that night than he had in years. Not because he was proving something to the world, but because, for the first time, he wasn't carrying anyone else's weight. Backstage, someone asked him if he was nervous without Frank. Dean laughed softly. I've never been alone, he said. I just finally stopped being overshadowed. And somewhere in the city, Frank Sinatra listened to the applause echo across the strip and understood a painful truth. Dean Martin hadn't needed him to succeed. Dean Martin had chosen him, and choice, once withdrawn, was far more powerful than loyalty ever forced to stay. The balance had shifted, and now Frank would have to decide whether he could stand beside Dean Martin. Not as a legend looking down, but as a man finally looking across. The man who chose forgiveness without forgetting. The applause at Caesar's Palace didn't fade quickly. It rolled through the corridors long after the curtain fell, slipping beneath doors, echoing through marble halls, settling into the bones of the building the way truth settles when it finally finds a place to rest. Dean Martin stood alone in his dressing room afterward, tuxedo jacket draped neatly over a chair, hands resting on the vanity as he studied his reflection. Not with vanity, not with triumph, but with recognition. This was the face of a man who had chosen himself and lived to tell the story. The room was quiet, no laughter spilling in from friends, no familiar voice teasing him from the hallway, just stillness, and for the first time in a long time, Dean didn't mistake that stillness for loneliness. It felt earned. It felt honest. A knock came at the door. Dean didn't turn. He didn't need to ask who it was. I know you didn't invite me, came the voice, low and careful, but I hoped you'd let me in anyway. Dean closed his eyes for a brief moment, then exhaled. Come in, Frank. Frank Sinatra stepped inside without the swagger that once preceded him. No entourage. No smile meant to soften the ground. Just a man carrying the weight of something he could no longer sing his way out of. I heard the show, Frank said quietly. You were incredible. Dean nodded once, thank you. They stood like that for a moment, the space between them filled with history. Laughter shared, wounds inflicted, nights spent believing loyalty was indestructible. Frank broke first, as men often do when pride has finally run out of places to hide. "I didn't come to ask you to come back," Frank said. "I came to say something I should have said a long time ago." Dean turned then, meeting his eyes fully. "Go on." "I didn't humiliate you because I thought you were weak," Frank admitted. "I did it because I was afraid you were strong enough to leave me." The honesty landed harder than any insult ever had. Dean studied him, searching for deflection, for drama, for anything that resembled the old Frank. He found none of it. What stood before him now was something rarer and far more dangerous, a man stripped of excuses. "You made me kneel that night," Frank continued, voice tight. "Not on stage, inside. You didn't yell, you didn't fight dirty. You just told the truth, and the truth doesn't need volume." Dean's expression didn't change. Truth also doesn't erase consequences. "I know," Frank said, "and I'm not asking it to." Silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was deliberate. "I spent my life believing control was the same thing as respect," Frank said softly. "And tonight, watching you stand alone on that stage, I realized how wrong I was." Dean walked past him, poured 2 glasses of water, and handed one over. A simple gesture, not forgiveness, not rejection, a beginning. "I didn't leave to punish you," Dean said. "I left because staying would have taught me to accept something I couldn't live with." Frank nodded. "You were right." Dean met his gaze. "But understand this, what we have now isn't what we had before. That version of us was built on imbalance, on me being the easy one, the forgiving one, the one who smoothed things over." "And now?" Frank asked. "Now," Dean said calmly, "it's built on choice. You don't get me by default anymore, you earn me." Frank's eyes glistened, not with performance but with something quieter. "I can live with that," he said, "because I don't want the old version if it means losing you again." Dean nodded. "Good." They didn't hug, they didn't laugh. They didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. And somehow that made the moment more powerful than any reconciliation Hollywood could have scripted. The world noticed the change. When Dean and Frank appeared together again months later, it wasn't announced as a comeback. There were no banners promising nostalgia. They walked onto the stage separately, met at the microphone as equals, and sang, not to prove anything, but because they chose to. The chemistry was different now. Cleaner, sharper, built on respect instead of habit, and the audience felt it even if they couldn't explain why. Backstage, a young performer once asked Dean how he'd found the courage to stand his ground against someone as powerful as Frank Sinatra. Dean smiled gently. "Courage isn't loud," he said. "It's quiet. It's deciding what you won't accept even if it costs you everything." Years later, when both men were older and the lights shone softer, someone asked Frank what the hardest lesson of his life had been. Frank didn't hesitate. "Learning that the people who love you the most don't need to be controlled," he said. "They need to be respected." When Frank passed, those closest to him said something in him had changed after that night. After Dean stood firm without cruelty, after forgiveness was offered without surrender. Losing Dean later broke something in Frank that never fully healed, because some friendships don't just shape your career. They shape who you become when the spotlight fades. And that was the final lesson Dean Martin left behind. Not sung, not shouted, but lived. That real strength doesn't come from winning an argument, or dominating a stage, or forcing someone to kneel. It comes from knowing when to stand, when to walk away, and when only when it truly matters. To open the door again without losing yourself. What history almost missed. Time has a strange way of softening sharp edges without erasing the scars. Months passed after that night at Caesar's palace, and the headlines slowly moved on as they always did. New scandals replaced old ones. New stars demanded attention. To the public, the storm between Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra became just another chapter in Hollywood folklore, dramatic, entertaining, easily summarized in a few careless sentences. But history almost missed the truth. Because the real story didn't live on stages or in newspapers anymore. It lived in the quiet decisions Dean made every single day afterward, the decisions that never made headlines but changed everything. Dean's solo run became something no one had predicted. Not louder, not flashier, stronger, cleaner. Audiences didn't come to see him because he was part of something iconic anymore. They came because he was enough on his own. Each performance felt deliberate, unhurried, as if he had finally learned that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And yet beneath that calm success, Dean carried something heavier than fame, the responsibility of having chosen dignity over vengeance. Because forgiveness, when offered without forgetting, demands more strength than walking away forever. Frank felt the distance, even when they shared the same room. It showed in the way he watched Dean now, carefully, respectfully, as if afraid one careless word could undo months of restraint. The jokes were gentler, the banter less sharp. Frank, for the first time in his life, measured his words around someone not because he feared backlash, but because he feared loss. And that fear changed him. People noticed, not all at once, but gradually. Frank listened more, interrupted less. When someone disagreed with him, he didn't immediately crush the room into silence. The man who once ruled by force of will began ruling by something far rarer, humility. It wasn't redemption in the cinematic sense. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic public apologies repeated endlessly, just quiet correction, quiet effort, quiet respect. And Dean noticed. The real test came years later, long after the memory of that night had faded for everyone else. They were older now, slower. The world had moved forward, but it still made room for them because legends never truly leave. They just stopped demanding attention. During a tribute rehearsal, a young producer nervously suggested changing a song order, something Frank might once have taken as an insult. The room tensed. Frank glanced at Dean before responding. "What do you think?" Frank asked him. The question stunned everyone, not because it was polite, but because it was sincere. Dean smiled faintly. "I think it's worth trying." Frank nodded. "Then we'll try it." That was it, no ego, no argument. In that moment, Dean understood something important. The man standing beside him had finally learned the lesson that night was meant to teach, and not everyone does. When Dean passed years later, the world mourned the voice, the charm, the laughter. But those closest to Frank saw something else, a grief that ran deeper than nostalgia. They said Frank was quieter after that, less interested in applause, more aware of how fragile time really was. At a private gathering, someone once asked Frank what he regretted most in his life. He didn't say marriages. He didn't say business decisions. He didn't say missed opportunities. "I regret thinking loyalty meant someone would always stay," Frank said softly, "instead of realizing loyalty is something you protect." That answer never appeared in a headline, but it mattered more than any that ever did. This is what the audience never saw. Not just a man insulted on a stage. Not just a comeback. Not just reconciliation. They missed the quiet revolution that followed. The way Dean Martin redefined strength without ever raising his voice. The way Frank Sinatra learned that power doesn't come from making someone kneel, but from being willing to kneel yourself when you're wrong. Dean didn't win that night because he embarrassed Frank back. He won because he refused to become what hurt him. And that choice echoed long after the lights dimmed, long after the songs ended, long after both men were gone. Because real legacy isn't built in applause. It's built in the moments when no one is watching, and you still choose to do the right thing. The moment the world never saw. Years passed the way they always do, quietly, without permission. The noise faded. The stages grew familiar again. The audience aged alongside the legends they once screamed for. To the world, the story of Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra had already been written, summarized, simplified, and filed away as another tale of ego and reconciliation in Hollywood history. But the most important moment between them didn't happen on a stage. It happened when no one was watching. They were alone in a quiet dressing room years later, far from the chaos of Las Vegas, far from cameras and applause. No audience, no reporters, no reason to perform. Just two men who had lived long enough to understand that legacy wasn't built by how loudly people cheered, but by what remained when the cheering stopped. Frank sat heavily in a chair, older now, the weight of decades finally visible in his posture. The voice that once filled arenas now carried fatigue beneath its confidence. Dean stood near the window, hands in his pockets, watching the city lights flicker on as evening settled in. "You ever think about that night?" Frank asked suddenly. Dean didn't turn, more than I probably should. Frank nodded. "I think about it every day." That admission mattered. Frank Sinatra did not live in regret publicly. He buried it under work, under music, under applause. But here alone, there was nothing to hide behind. I thought power meant people couldn't leave you, Frank said quietly. Turns out, power just makes it hurt more when they do. Dean finally turned toward him. I didn't leave to hurt you. I know, Frank said. That's what hurt the most. Silence settled between them, not awkward, not tense, but full. The kind of silence that only comes when everything worth saying has already been said. You saved me, Frank said then. Dean raised an eyebrow. By walking away. By not destroying me, Frank replied. You could have crushed me that night. You had the room, you had the truth, you had every right. Instead, you held the line and made me face myself. Dean considered that. I didn't do it for you. I know, Frank said softly. You did it for yourself, and that's why it worked. Not long after, the world began honoring them, not as rivals, not as scandal, but as history, tributes, retrospectives, carefully edited montages that showed laughter, harmony, brotherhood. The audience saw what they wanted to see, the magic. What they never saw was the work. They never saw Frank pause before speaking, measuring his words with care he'd never had before. They never saw Dean refuse offers that would have diminished him just to stay comfortable. They never saw the private conversations where pride was swallowed, boundaries were respected, and forgiveness was practiced, not once but repeatedly. Because forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a discipline. When Dean's health began to fail, Frank visited quietly. No announcements, no public appearances. Just a man sitting beside another man who had once forced him to confront everything he feared about himself. You know, Frank said one afternoon, voice barely above a whisper, I spent my whole life making sure no one ever saw me weak. Dean smiled faintly. And how'd that work out? Frank chuckled, then sighed. Didn't, you were the only one who ever saw me clearly. Dean looked at him, eyes calm, steady. That's because I never needed you to be anything but human. Frank's eyes filled, but he didn't look away. Thank you for not letting me stay a bully, he said. Thank you for making me earn you. Dean nodded once. That was the point. After Dean was gone, those closest to Frank said something in him changed permanently. He performed less, spoke slower, listened more. It was as if losing Dean had carved a permanent reminder into him that some people aren't replaceable and some lessons only arrive once. At a private gathering near the end of his life, someone asked Frank what true strength looked like. He didn't hesitate. Strength, Frank said, is having the power to destroy someone and choosing not to. Strength is letting someone walk away, fixing yourself instead of blaming them, and hoping you're lucky enough to earn their way back. No one applauded. They didn't need to. This is why the story still matters. Not because Frank Sinatra insulted Dean Martin on a stage. Not because Dean defended himself with grace. Not even because forgiveness followed. It matters because one man chose dignity over dominance, and another man learned, too late but not too late, that respect is the only power that lasts. Dean Martin didn't put Frank Sinatra on his knees with anger. He did it with truth. And then, when Frank finally stood back up, Dean made sure he stood as an equal. That's the part history almost missed. And that's why the story will never stop being told.